Hello, dear friends. Good afternoon to our universal philosophical community, the White Tower. Today's guest is Dr. Jackson Hoerth, who is a university professor at Tyler, USA. Good afternoon, Dr. Hoerth. So his work focuses on Kant, with particular interest in aesthetics and cognition. He has done a lot of work on the interpretation of the imagination in the third critique that offers a more central role for aesthetic experience in Kant's critical framework. And in addition, he has interests in 19th century responses to Kant, with special focus on the German Idealism. Dr. Hoerth, would you like to add any other information regarding your work?
Yes. So, as you very clearly pointed out, my work is on the imagination within a Kantian framework. And I'm also interested in the philosophy of mind and with links to cognition, in particular with how we can understand or better understand mental health and neurodiversity through the use of the imagination.
Great. Really tough issues, I have to admit. Why did you choose Kant in the first place as a philosopher?
Absolutely. So Kant was really exceptionally fascinating because when I first encountered his work, I had the thought that he seems to be one of the most important thinkers that very few of us have ever heard of. Now,
Mm.
us in the philosophic community, we know Kant, we know his name, very important. But outside of philosophy, his name doesn't really come up very much. However, he really set the stage for a lot of the ways that we think about thinking about the human mind, about our sort of individual relationship with reality, that structures a lot of what we think in terms of psychology, in terms of neurobiology. And he set this stage for it, yet we don't really give him credit for it. He's not really mentioned, but there is just such a rich ground there for investigation that once I figured out what he was up to, I found him so fascinating, and I really I couldn't put him down. His work was just so rich and had so much to think about.
And we're so happy today that you being here as our guest are going to help actually our audience to shed light on these critical issues and problems of our times. So we're trying to combine both theory and practice in a way. So Immanuel Kant and orientation thinking. Let's start from this. How is orientation in thought understood? What does it actually mean to orient ourselves in thought? I mean, human beings need to orient themselves in a contemplative manner, unfolding both theory and practice sometimes, combining intuition and concept, experience and rational meaning. So, on the one hand, we've got reason, which shapes intuitions of the external phenomena based on space and time. And on the other hand, um, um, humans are in internal communication with their intellect, so-called Verstand in German, if I'm not mistaken. So thought orientation actually means the production of knowledge from both sensibility, which works as a receptive mode, and intellect, which actually plays the role of the productive mode. And Kant actually says intuitions without concepts are blind, in the sense that it is necessary to make one's concepts sensible as it is to make one's intuitions intellectual. So our first question is, of course, you can comment on these theoretical issues. Where shall someone start from so as to cultivate his own thinking process? Is it an outside-in or an inside-out process?
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I really am drawn to Kant, and I think he's a very, very special thinker, is he he kind of exists at this turning point in philosophy, right? So one thing that you mentioned is there's this idea of we inquire into our rationality to obtain knowledge, and then there's this other idea that we inquire into our sense perceptions, our observations to acquire knowledge. And Kant is at a really unique position in that he in his transcendental philosophy, he tries to find a way to like unite both of these ideas, but also, and in doing so, created something completely unique, right? So what I kind of like about Kant is that he, in a very real way, he is sort of, to answer your question, is both. In a way, he does recognize the importance of, the outside in, the importance of sense observation. He was a man of science. He was a natural philosopher. He was very, very interested in the natural sciences and the things that we could learn from them. So there's clearly that aspect in his philosophy. But he was also trained as a rationalist in this great rationalist tradition, in particular in continental Europe. And so he recognizes the impact that human thinking and human reason has on the types of things that we observe. So I think Kant's project and this idea of orienting ourselves in thinking is kind of keeping in mind or having as a starting point this idea that our observations, our experiences are going to be fundamentally human experiences. And it is that human aspect that is going to impact or shape or form a lot of the types of things that we see. But rather than thinking of this as kind of a subjective or a relativist perspective on knowledge, he thinks that because we have these shared objective ways in which we approach reality through things like sensibility, through things like the impact of space and time on our experiences, that this will yield objective knowledge that we can share and that we can talk about and that we can discover in various disciplines like the natural sciences. Kant being very interested in things like geology and astronomy. He believes that this is sort of how we go about
Yeah.
investigating the world as humans.
So combining both, not taking sides.
Yes, no taking sides, but also this is my German idealism background coming back to me. But in
Yeah,
taking one
sure.
and taking the other, the reason and the sensibility, combining them into something that's completely that transcends both. Right?
Mhm,
That's my Hegel background coming in, but it's true. We see it in Kant as well.
yeah,
He's not just a rationalism plus empiricism, but he's something completely different and really changes the paradigm in our investigations of ourself and the world around us.
I agree. Um, Now, how could we navigate the path to knowledge? We know that human beings follow some chaotic feelings, um, but feelings themselves have their own axioms, their own rules and principles related to the forms of our external world and also our internal world, space and time, respectively. Now, these result in the emergence of observations and perceptions, of course, through the senses. And they are further shaped by concepts, and especially by supreme concepts known as categories. Now, throughout this process, the intellect, the Verstand, contributes by formulating judgments, by judging, something which expresses human knowledge in a sense. And of course, as you have said before, reason plays a vital role towards objective knowledge, rationalizing things. Um, and logos also is very important in the sense. So then a question arises. Um, when we have to shed light on issues concerning, for example, religious or metaphysical truths, should it be faith or reason that we have to be based on?
Sure. So I think that's an excellent question. Yeah, reason or faith on
Yeah.
large metaphysical issues. So
And
I
what
think,
Kant has to say on it
yes.
about this.
So, yeah. So I think one thing that's kind of interesting that you've brought up on this idea of faith, or almost our ability to think about or reason about our world and existence and these types of things. One thing that's kind of remarkable about Kant, or about sort of his system here, that gets into a question of the imagination, is we almost take it as um, assumed, right? We almost non-critically examine the fact that, as a being with reason and as a being with sensibility, that these two things just seem to kind of connect to each other. We kind of assume that, I'm able to think and apply concepts to the world around me and to the outside world. And we almost take that on faith. We almost take that on belief. It's on assumption. It just works out this way. And I think one way to kind of examine Kant and what he's up to in his transcendental philosophy is, how do we want to approach that question, right? How do we want to approach the connection between our mind, our reason, and the outside world? And I think we could either say, well, we're really lucky, thank God that they tend to connect. But I think we can provide a bit better of an explanation with that. And this is the role of the imagination, and this is why I took the imagination as a very important faculty in my work, is because and we can get into details, later on in the conversation, but to kind of
Of
just
course.
introduce the idea so we know what we're talking about. Um, the imagination is in certain readings of Kant, and certainly my reading of Kant, the imagination is the pivotal link. It is the bridge, if you would, between this divide that sort of conceptually exists between the sensible world on one hand and our thoughts, our concepts on the other, right? The imagination in Kant is intended to provide a bridge for this,
Mhm.
so that we can have a certain level of comfort, or expectation, or objectivity, really, when we apply our concepts, when we apply our thoughts, when we apply our reason to the types of things that we observe.
Great. Um, Now, regarding to the concepts, we know that in Kant's syllogism, there are a priori and also a posteriori concepts. Now, judgments, intuitions, and concepts are independent from experience and determined by sensory perceptions. These concepts are called a priori. And if their content is based on experience, they are called a posteriori. There are some criteria for a priori knowledge, such as necessity as well as universality. Now, if something is true a priori, we don't simply know that it happens to be true, but it must be true. This is the criterion of the necessity. But it can also be applied on a universal basis, so long as it has no exceptions. For example, 7 plus 5 equals 12, not 13. Um, Furthermore, experience can never provide evidence for strict universality, but only for generality, because it's experience. So empirical knowledge, in fact, is always synthetic, but it can be falsified at times, like in the example, all swans are white. We can find some black swans if we search. So a question then arises, when making judgments, when we make judgments, where shall we start from as human beings? Because we're lost in space and time it's too often. So where is our starting point?
Yes. So I think with Kant, and this goes back to his background and his interests as a natural scientist and in the natural sciences. Kant really does want to reserve experience as being this starting point of knowledge.
Mm,
Um, and it is through experience that we generally begin to build our knowledge in this way. But of course, as we know about what we've talked about so far about Kant, it by no means ends here with objective with experience, right? There is the imposition of the mind. There is the forms that our experience has to take. And in order to truly understand what it is we are observing for Kant, we have to have an understanding of exactly how the type of being that we are, this sort of discursive intellect, this intellect that uses concepts to be able to sort of find our way through nature, find our way through existence. That because we are this type of being, that in order to have objective knowledge that begins with sensibility, we have to also have an understanding of the way that we ourselves impact or influence the types of experiences that we have. And that's kind of the main I think that's one of the main programs of for example, his critique of pure reason is this: how is it that we are shaping reality? How is it that we are shaping experience? And and then what is the relationship between the two?
So, do you think this is an easy process of making judgments on behalf of human beings that are in a total chaos at times? How would you put it? Is it worth trying, or just don't make judgments until you are um, fully equipped with some data, let's say, and gather some clues that might help you formulate your concepts, let's say. How would you put
Sure.
it? Yeah.
So I think with Kant, it we want to start with this idea of thinking for oneself. This is
Hmm.
a principle that Kant is very, very big on, right? The sapreate, right? Just thinking for yourself and daring to
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Right. And as a an Enlightenment philosopher, a philosopher that's very influenced by the Enlightenment and Enlightenment thinking, that it begins with kind of in individuals' drive to know, drive to learn,
That's a
and
yeah.
and I think that's where we begin. And
Hmm.
of course, through the process, we uh, we become more refined and better understand the types of observations that we are receiving or are making, and we can certainly refine the types of judgments we make, and we can exercise judgment and better exercise judgment in a lot of ways. But it begins with the desire to know, the desire to think for oneself, the desire to um, step over or overcome one's, as Kant would put it, one's minority, right? One's, immaturity would probably be a word that we would use, right? And truly become a self-oriented thinker, right? Become what Kant would call, achieving majority. Not that a majority of people become this way, that's neither here nor there. But entering into a state of majority where you orient yourself in thinking. You are the one who is making the judgments, and you are the one who is kind of in a way taking
Yeah.
responsibility for how one observes the world and the judgments one makes about it.
So long as you feel this inner desire for self-discovery. Um, yeah. So true. I believe that this is enough for an individual to just start his journey for self-discovery. Um, now, we're also interested in Kant's syllogism about goodwill. I mean, what does Kant tell us about goodwill? We know for sure that goodwill is good under any circumstances, but also intertwined with the absolute good, without depending on other things. Furthermore, goodwill is not a panacea. There are other qualities which are also categorized as good, such as restraint in impulses and passions, self-control, sober thinking, but they're not unconditionally good in the sense that depending on the good or the bad will of the person who uses them, the same qualities become either good or bad. So goodwill is used as a prerequisite for the good to arise. And of course, goodwill continues to be good, even if it can't fulfill its intended purposes due to bad luck. I mean, bad luck is bad luck. Nobody can predict the actual circumstances, whatever will he himself possesses. Also, we know that reason could be used as an instrumental tool for the goodwill towards its own journey, but it does not itself direct towards well-being or happiness. We believe that its aim is to create a will that is going to be good in itself. And most importantly, is going to safeguard reason from immersing in rhetorical deluge. I mean, this foolishness, this feeling of immaturity on behalf of human beings. So, all in all, we would like to ask you, how easy is it to preserve human life from an unethical communication? The one we find in chatterers, sophists, they talk and nothing important is ever concluded.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful question, right? So how can we how it kind of looks at like a little bit of a bigger issue with philosophy, and it's kind of like how can we do more than speak? How can this be more than words? Right? That's kind of what we're always looking for. And I think with Kant, I think one of the reasons why, for example, his ethics is at least very attractive to me is that it's not really the type of it's not with this idea of we cannot guarantee happiness, we cannot guarantee well-being, we cannot guarantee the greater good or something like that, which are principles for other ethical approaches. With Kant, the morality of one's actions, the morality of one's choices is immediately clear. And one of the reasons why it's beneficial is it gives the agent, right? This idea of, again, thinking for yourself, acting for yourself, this idea of agency, right? It gives the agent all the knowledge, all the information, all the justification, everything it needs before it makes a decision whether or not to act morally or immorally, right? So for
like
Kant,
some sort of data.
Yes, we have all the information right there before, which is great, because when we talk about happiness or well-being or greater good, we don't know, right? I can make a choice and I don't know if it's going to make me happy. I hope it does, right? Or I don't know if it's going to benefit people around me or contribute to a greater good. I can hope it does, but that's all it is. Hope.
Yeah.
Right? We want our ethics to be we want it to be certain, right? We want it to be knowledge. We want to say, I am doing the right thing. And if it makes me unhappy, or if it doesn't make everyone around me better, I've still done the right thing. right? And so that's kind of this idea of safeguarding reason from this immaturity, right? Where like think about the child who misbehaves, right? They're going to give you 100 explanations as to why what they did was actually right, right?
Yeah.
And that's that immaturity of reason that like, well, okay, it helped this person or it turned out this way or it did that, and look at all these things that it did. And then but the question is, but it was wrong, right? That's the answer is ultimately like it was wrong and you knew it was wrong. And you can be immature and you can point to the various hypotheticals of the world, but in the Kantian ethical system that's based on this, the commands of reason, the categorical imperatives, you know what is right, you know the right action before you take the action. So you are a supreme moral agent, right? You are a supreme moral agent and you have absolute responsibility. And I think that as an ethical approach, right, basing it on reason, basing it on these principles that are not subject to the contingencies of the world, really provides a strong and clear um, foundation for us to be able to exercise our reason in the world, which is what we are trying to do when we attempt to engage the world ethically. It's about exercising reason in the world. Right? That's what ethics is for Kant.
Great.
And we do it through these principles.
Great explanation. And of course, the risk factor is also um, comes into play. We have to take risks, in other words.
Yes, absolutely. Right. And that
Yeah,
comes down to saying, like, I don't know if this is going to make me happy. I don't know if this is going to, help my well-being. I don't know if I can, if this is to my advantage. I don't know if this is going to be advantage to the greater world or something like that. You do have to
yeah.
take a risk, right? Again, our reason, our rationality is not out there in the world, right? Objectively speaking.
Mhm.
Our reason is an operation of us, right? At least as it appears in ethics.
Yeah, we're
So
the
when we,
agents, right?
yes, when we attempt to, act rationally or put our reason out into the world, because these two things are different, there's no guarantee that it's going to end up well for us, right? The most ethical person might be the most miserable and least happy person. It's possible. Now, I wouldn't want that. I hope it's different,
Hmm, hmm.
but if it's not, that should not change my ethical reasoning or the ethical reasoning for the Kantian at all.
Yeah, these ethical principles should stay intact,
Always.
no matter what.
Mhm.
A great explanation. Now, regarding critical philosophy and its principles, we know that the principles of critical spirit are found in ancient Greek thought, and they go back in the pre-Socratics, who reflect core issues of value, morality, practicality, politics, and of course, Kant's critique of pure reason is not a synthesis of the philosophical currents of his time, as you have already mentioned, rationalism, empiricism, and enlightenment. But critique of purism actually emerges as a philosophical method and identification of philosophy with critique, some sort of autonomous kind of current. And its aim is not to cancel old metaphysics and all the ideas of the past, but to give a new scientific foundation towards objective knowledge by freeing reason from all the misconceptions and delusions of the past. We believe this is the core issue of the pure reason. So, in such a way, reason can find its own destination through the driving principle of self critical ability, as you have mentioned, self control, self contemplation. Now, how would you define, in your own words, the term critical philosophy? I mean, isn't the term philosophy enough to imply the criticism underneath? Or why do you say critical philosophy and not just philosophy? Doesn't philosophy itself imply this criticism?
I think I mean I think there's a couple of things that we could say about that.
Mhm.
Certainly there is a tradition of philosophy. There certainly philosophy has the tradition of not just like inquiring into, I suppose, the foundations of things, right? Trying to not just take what we have and, assume it's true and operate from there, but instead to try to understand the source or I suppose the source would probably be the best term, the source of what we
Yeah.
have. Right. So, why is it that, our sense observations appear in a certain way? Why is it that our thinking tends to follow certain pathways? And I think that that is where philosophy is at its best, and is when it's engaging in that type of awareness. I think that's what it does specifically well. I think that's its I mean that's if you want to find something that philosophy does that other practices either don't do or struggle to do, I think that's it for philosophy. I think it is this critical aspect. We might say, though, that the introduction of a specifically critical philosophy would almost be a philosophy that is explicitly dedicated to this, right? As saying there's a lot philosophy can do, and that's apparent throughout its tradition. There's a lot of insights of philosophy, a lot of approaches to philosophy, a lot of ways in which philosophy interacts with our reality, our environment, our experience, and these types of things. And I think when one explicitly calls something critical philosophy, I think we could look at it as emphasizing this particular aspect of philosophy to say we are going to um, start at the foundations. We are going to examine, not just the foundations maybe, but examine like how we can almost examine the foundations, if you would. And I think in stating, something being critical philosophy as opposed to maybe philosophy in general, it indicates a specific approach or a specific goal in mind to emphasize the foundations or the sources of the types of experience we have. And I think that does play out well with certainly with Kant's critical philosophy in his three critiques. I think broadly speaking, that's what he's attempting to do.
Yeah. Travel back to time and trying to put ourselves into pre-Socratic's way of thinking. Um, would it be an easy thing to do, or is it okay to keep our own logic and thinking process?
Yeah. That's a good question. I think that comes down to exactly how much can one step outside of their own perspective. And my my interest my side interests beyond Kant, oddly enough, are the phenomenology. And so my inner phenomenologist is saying like, well, hold on. You know, any access that we have to the pre-Socratics is going to be, it's always going to be reflected and understood through contemporary thought. So it's a sort of contemporary understanding of the pre-Socratics. Not necessarily a bad thing, but I feel like that's the window that we have, right? It's
Yeah,
like it's like speaking a language. So I speak a little bit of German, but whenever I speak to a native German speaker, they know immediately that I'm a native English speaker, just because of the way that I structure my sentences. right? They just know.
Sure.
It's like, yeah, you're okay. You're
Sure.
an English speaker who's speaking German. And I don't know how to get outside of that. I don't know if I can, right? Just because like that's the way my mind structures language, right? Subject, verb, object, which is perfectly fine in German, but it's not necessary. But I that's me.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the way my interior mechanisms of thinking language work. And I
Right,
and
yeah.
I wonder how one can truly get outside of it. Yeah, I think that's a very big philosophic question. But interestingly enough, I think it's one that Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy, this idea of, putting the perspective or putting the position at which one is making a judgment, putting that as central to the type of judgment and experience one has, it ushers in this conversation. So we kind of bring it home to Kant. This is
Yeah,
why it's important.
yeah, because it's not only who reads something or what someone reads,
Mhm.
it's all about how somebody reads something. The way how is very important. I mean, the whole structure, um, the whole thing. Now, turning to phenomenology and the thing in itself, phenomenon, according to Kant, is neither an illusory appearance nor an absolute reality, but an empirical reality, the objects of possible experience. Now, the knowledge of things by sense is called phenomena, whereas the knowledge that the intellect has about things is called noumena, where the objective knowledge is also limited to an area of possible experience. We know that Kant believes that the only objective object, if we can use this phrase, is the phenomena, mediated by the senses and subject to our supervision, both in space and time, because he pretty much believes that we have no knowledge of the noumena, of the things in themselves. We cannot have that kind of knowledge. We can only have the knowledge of the phenomenon as an object of our sensory supervision.
Mhm.
Um, Now, and of course, the phenomena as a word actually means the physical objects,
Mhm.
according to Kant. The physical objects existing external to the mind in space and time. Now, to what degree these phenomena correspond to our everyday reality?
So, kind of getting back to a question you asked me earlier about where does it start, right? Kant seems to be pretty clear. It starts with the phenomena. It starts with experience. That is our access to reality. And I think where the let's say Kant would say the non-Kantian kind of makes the error is that they mistake the things that appear, right? Phenomena like as appearances.
Yeah,
They mistake that for what is, right? For the thing itself. And the insight of Kant is that is the idea that says we can understand the world objectively through phenomena, through the things that appear to us. But in order to truly understand the world and not make the sort of naive mistakes that say like, oh, the phenomena
yeah,
are literally reality, what we have to do is we have to go back to the critical philosophy and understand exactly how does the type of being that I am shape the phenomena? Because
interpret them. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Because you have to know both.
yeah,
Because what you're experiencing is
yeah.
real. It is objective, but it has your
But
fingerprint all over it. And so you have to understand exactly how are you shaping it. And that's the entire critical project. That's why Kant that's why he exists at this crossroads, but really provides something entirely new to our ability to investigate the world and investigate reality and turn inward and investigate ourselves as well. It's a sort of a dual reinterpretation of the relationship between subject and object. whereas they're not, essentially two separate beings, separate entities, but they interact on an extremely fundamental level, and we have to understand the nature of that interaction. Otherwise, reality will forever elude our grasp because we're
Yeah,
examining the wrong thing.
exactly. So two-way communication. Um, Now, there is a difference between a critical and a dialectical reason. Kant, of course, says that we have to have a strict and constant criticism of values, as you have said, institutions, positions, ideologies in all scientific fields. He becomes aware of his identity, which means that the representations that are formed within the subject himself, regardless of whether they are correct or not, at least in the first phase, are nevertheless legitimized as a process of the subject who makes judgments later on regarding the attribution of the object's representations to himself. That is, after forming some sort of representations, the subject makes some sort of judgments, which in fact legitimize this internalization of the outer sensations. But Hegel says that dialectics, because Hegel has to do with dialectics, is not only an internal affair of how the interpretation of phenomena works, but also the driving force of the universe and the interconnectedness between being and thinking. Now, two different approaches, maybe they overlap up to a degree. You could refer to this. I mean, if these two approaches overlap, and do people ever contemplate upon their thoughts to analyze everyday phenomena? Do they have the time to do it?
I think that's kind of an interesting idea. It's almost like even if we have the capacity, do we have the leisure to do it? Like, do we
Hmm.
have you know
Yeah,
uh, are we able to practice philosophy, let's say, even
yeah,
in an age where information at you so quickly and ideas and opinions are they're multiple and infinite
yeah. I
almost.
mean, freeze
How
time and just have 5 minutes break. And instead of doing yoga or something crazy stuff, just contemplate upon your thoughts for at least 3 minutes. I mean, who actually um, does it? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I would always recommend it, but I think almost, but think about it like this.
mhm,
I'm gonna use a little bit of a metaphor here, and we'll see if it
yeah,
works.
okay,
Um, I think about it like the metaphor of exercise, right? You can say, all right, I'm going to go spend 30 minutes, an hour in the gym, right? I'm going to section that time and just that's my time to go exercise and that's my time to go be, active and physical. That's one way to approach it. But actually, I think the most those who have the most success with these types of things aren't the ones who just say, okay, here's my exercise time. It's in my schedule, block it off. And then once I'm done, check it off the list, we're good. But instead, the ones that seem to be the most effective with this type of thing are simply the ones who integrate it into their everyday life, right? That just say, like, I don't really think about it. I just live in a way that engenders physical activity. Well, now we
even better. Yeah,
yeah, I think so. Right? Because there's no resistance then, right? There's no
yeah,
like, oh, I gotta go do this. I gotta do this so I can check it off the list. But it's instead, I live
yeah.
this way.
I mean,
So
yeah, creatures of habit.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
So take that example and put it into thinking, right? Whether it's a critical analysis or dialectical thinking or whatever it might be. The best thing I think one can do is to engage constantly in dialogue with either with yourself or with another, that's excellent. Like what we're doing here is the best. But even if you can't engage with another person, you can always engage with yourself, right? You can always go about your activities of your day, whether it's, cooking, cleaning, doing dishes, doing the laundry, like if I'm taking care of my daughter or something, right? Like I can still have an internal thinking mechanism going on as long as I'm not doing something that requires immediate attention. A lot of what we do doesn't. So you can learn to kind of just make thinking a part of your life. Make, dialectics a part of your life. Make critical analysis just kind of always just fall into it if you need to, and practice it to the point where you just live a life where you're thinking, and you don't need to, you know, schedule time or say like, oh, this is my specific thinking time. Don't bother me. Well, if you're always thinking, then you're going to get your time in, and you're going to practice it, and it's going to become a lifestyle. It's going to become a habit, if you would. And I think
Yeah.
that's what I would recommend, if one is interested in philosophy in this way, and saying, how do I maintain this sort of critical view? How do I maintain this kind of dialectic? You just maintain it. You commit yourself to it, and you live it as best you can when you can, rather than
Great.
saying this is the time I'm going to do it. Yeah.
The best solution I've ever heard. When the habit becomes actually second nature, we have a similar expression in Greek, which goes like "exis δεύτερα physis." That's exactly the meaning um, of your speech. Yeah, that's
That's
exactly
wonderful.
that. Yeah, of your argumentation. Um, Great. So Kant also refers to the certainty of our existence, and if we can find the certainty of existence, actually, of course, human reason, according to Kant, is overloaded with questions. Questions reason cannot avoid in the first place, but it cannot answer in the end, because it's limited to mere apparent knowledge, at least. At least um, uh, in the first place. So reason itself cannot be limited to the limitations of experience, but it is also founded prior to it, a priori, as a cognitive power, and of course reveals its power with self-criticism. Pure reason is that which contains the principles that allow us to know something absolutely a priori. So thanks to reason itself, Kant invests on the logical capacity of human beings, but those human beings who carry the moral law. So in a sense, the moral law can determine one's will and direct it towards the good so as to make it a good will.
Mhm.
Now, I wonder, what does it take for someone to utilize his virtues, his moral codes, to navigate the world?
Yeah. So there's a simple answer, and there's one that's a little bit more nuanced. The simple answer is, well, sheer will in a lot of cases. You just do it.
Just to,
Um, you just do. Which is a completely acceptable answer for the Kantian.
of course.
However, Kant is not so, let's say, naive about
Mm,
humans, right? Uh, and he th- this I used the word earlier, this idea of hope.
yeah. Would you say, for example, 6, 7, 8, wait, wait, wait?
Sure, yeah.
The sense.
Um,
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean,
I think so. Um,
yeah.
and this idea of hope is key for kind of putting Kant's whole system together, oddly enough. Um, and because we know the moral law as a result of reason, and that means there is no necessary connection between the moral law and the outside world. Um, but we are still expected by reason to carry out the moral law. But because there's a disconnect there, um, we do have things we do have for example like a sentimentality almost. So one of the things that Kant says is he says, there are people who are driven by genuine love for humanity. Now, genuine love for humanity is different than the moral law, right? A love
Yeah.
or compassion for humanity. That's different than the moral law. However, Kant says like this is a good thing, right? This is we should be happy about this. We should pray like, well, not praise it, but we should be happy about this. We should see this as fortunate that a lot of humans do seem to have compassion for other humans.
As an
Now,
opportunity. Yeah.
yeah, it's the type of thing that doesn't guarantee we're acting in terms of the moral law, but it does,
But
yes, it does show that there is kind of a connection between our nature and the moral law. Now, is that logically proven? Is that known a priori? Not necessarily, but we find signs, we find hope in the actions of humans, in the compassion of humans. We find hope in the beauty in nature, for example,
yeah,
that
there's
there
an
is,
optimism. There's an optimism about it.
yes, that we can hope. So how does one navigate the world, with the moral law in them and wanting to live in terms of the moral law in a world that appears to be at best disinterested towards the moral law? We search for signs of hope. We search for
Hmm.
optimism, and we can find optimism in, again, the compassion of humanity, in the beautiful things in nature, in these types of things. This can give us hope. This can give us encouragement. But ultimately, absent of that hope, let's say you don't see beauty in nature. Let's say you don't recognize the
Yeah.
compassion in other people. Well, then you got your duties and your obligations. You always have those. But it's a lot easier when you've got hope and encouragement. Everything is. And so there is that aspect in Kant's in his framework for the value of things like hope and optimism. And that gives us kind of a what I like to call a kinder, gentler Kant. He comes across as much less cold and unfeeling, which is
Great. Yeah. Yeah.
an impression that people can get with him. But he does have room for optimism, and he does have room for hope.
Oh,
And that's what I consider. If someone asks me,
very
why do
touching.
you?
Very touching. Yes. Yes.
Oh,
Hmm.
thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
When someone asks me, like, why do you prefer the third? Why is the third critique your favorite of the three critiques? My response is it's a book of hope. It's where Kant is,
Definitely.
where he's the most hopeful. And I
Mhm.
think that's an excellent thing to have in philosophy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. Um, that's great. Um, now, coming coming to your own paper
Mhm.
called Schematism and Free Play: The Imagination's Formal Power as a Unifying Feature in Kant's Doctrine of the Faculties. Um, you refer to the three critiques through the doctrine of the faculties, the powers, and your argument of this work exists in two parts. The first part is when the imagination's formal ability is present, as early as the schematism in the Critique of Pure Reason, and reaches its fullest exposition in instances of harmonious free play in the Critique of the Power of Judgment. So, in a way, you try to combine the first critique of the Pure Reason with the third one, that of the Power of Judgment. And actually, you divide judgment in a reflective one and an aesthetic one. You also have this subdivision. And also, a second argument of yours is that this formal capacity of the imagination, which has a dual role, a dual capacity, as you say, is key to not only demonstrating the imagination as an original, unified, and independent faculty throughout Kant's critical framework, So it has a unifying role to play throughout his three critiques, but also it serves as grounds for the purposiveness of nature, a key aspect, as you say, of Kantian aesthetics. That's a very deep and thoughtful perspective in imagination, and how is it used throughout Kant's critiques. So, as you say, in your first critique, imagination, you call one of your this chapter transcendental deduction and schematism. You mention two phases, actually explaining the role of the imagination itself. And as we have mentioned, imagination has a dual capacity. First, it mediates between sensible capacities and understanding, between senses and concepts, in other words. And in the second phase, imagination plays also a vital role in the formation of schemata, where schematism applies concepts to actual experience, as concepts themselves are applied to objects' representations. And when taken to consciousness, they form experience. So imagination has this dual capacity. And schemata are going to bridge the gap between the sensibility and understanding. What kind of prerequisites are necessary for someone to have this kind of imagination? In referring to one's personality traits. I mean, can anyone do this? I mean, is this kind of imagination accessible to almost anyone?
Okay, excellent question, because this is,
I mean, I just wonder, and yeah.
And it's one of the kind of keys in understanding exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about the imagination for Kant. So when we generally talk about imagination, if we were just, chatting not about this subject and we're talking about the imagination, we usually think of it as kind of this this ability to engage in in fanciful thinking, right? I'm using we think of like a child using their imagination to play or something like that. And while that's not necessarily incorrect, it's not the wrong use of the imagination for Kant is much more, it's a much more fundamental aspect of our faculties, or our ability to be a being that has experiences. So to kind of answer your question, it's not just open to almost anybody. This imagination is something that we, by definition, all have, right? So it's not necessarily, oh, well, this person has a very strong imagination, so their imagination can make these connections. All imaginations form schematism. Everyone has an imagination. This is a fundamental aspect of being the type of entity that has experiences like we do, right? Because remember, the fundamental goal, right? The problem of one of the sections, the transcendental deduction, is how do we bridge sensibility with our concepts? These are two separate things. Our concepts are, they're a priori, they are non-empirical, they are universal, and then there's sensibility, which is a posteriori. It's contingent. So we have these two things, yet we need both of them to have experience. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we bring these two things together? Well, the imagination is Kant's solution as this, what he would call a synthetic faculty, as this faculty that can synthesize what we receive through sensibility in a way that is amenable or harmonious to the types of concepts that we have. That needs to be bridged. So if you have experiences, you have the imagination that I'm talking about.
Great. And do you have to be um, an extrovert person or an introvert, or it doesn't matter?
Doesn't matter. It's this, these are one of the objective features of experience for Kant, the imagination. Much like
Yeah.
it's as necessary to experience as our concepts and sensibility. It is as necessary, right? Without sensibility, we can't have experience. Without our concepts, we can't have intelligible experience. Without the imagination to bridge these two, to synthesize these two, we can't have experience. This is what I mean when I talk about it being an independent and critical faculty for us. It cannot be taken away. So it's available. It's not just available. It's necessary for all beings that have experience like we do.
Right. And now that you're talking about imagination, it has the ability to produce these conditions for the connection between sensibility and understanding, as you have said, especially in the first critique, where it's guided by understanding. But that's not the case in the third critique, where it's guided by its own lawfulness, as you say. Um, Unlike the concept of the understanding, which is the case in the first critique. Now, this is a very subtle difference.
Mhm.
So it seems as if imagination um, goes down a second path.
Talk a little bit more about that. Absolutely. Um, so with our cognitions, right, when we're just having an experience, right, the imagination kind of it acts, as you mentioned, in the service of the understanding, right? The goal is to complete the application of the understanding's concept to what we would call the sensible manifold, right? The totality of senses that we receive, right? So, as a sensible being, we are constantly being bombarded with sense data through our eyes, through our ears, through our nerves, through our taste buds, through our nose, all these types of things. So we're getting a lot of sense data. And that data needs to be organized, and that data needs to be, in some cases, organized, in some cases, generalized, however, and it needs to be prepared for us to then say this is an applicable concept, right? So I'm looking at a stack of books here next to me. Sensibly, all I'm getting from this stack of books is, this color, this not even really shape, but like this it's like pixels in a way, right? We're getting these various pieces of color data that needs to be arranged in a way where I can then say this is book, book concept, right? Applied. And so in our everyday regular cognition, this is the goal of the imagination, to prepare the sense data to I suppose facilitate the connection between what we receive through our senses and what our existing concepts. That's the path of the imagination in cognition, but that changes, as you mentioned, in the third critique, in considerations of beautiful objects, in aesthetic judgments, in aesthetic experience. It's not that necessarily. So this is where my view differs from some views, but it's not the case that the imagination takes a different path, right?
Yeah, and especially we could see the difference of the imagination if we referred to the difference of between the reflective judgment and the aesthetic judgment. That's a
Yes,
practical way
absolutely.
of, yeah. So
That,
you can go on. So I'm sorry to interrupt you. Yeah.
oh, yeah, no trouble. Right. So with the imagination, it's not that it takes a different path, but what it does is the way that I envision it is that it provides a cognition. It does everything it needs to do to make an experience. After all, when I experience, I don't know, a beautiful sunset, let's say, I'm still experiencing a sunset. However, there is something additional.
Mhm.
right? There is something that cannot quite be um, encapsulated
Mhm.
within the concept of sunset, right? That's what's the difference between a sunset and a beautiful sunset, or a rose and a beautiful rose, right? There is something else. And that something else that exists after the concept of sunset or rose is applied, that something else becomes the material, the content for the imagination to now work on its own, free from the constraints of its task to create experience. It's already finished, right? So now it's already done its job. It's already created the experience, but now there's this extra content. There's this what I call meta content that exists, and that is the imagination is free to uh, to contemplate its own sort of lawfulness, contemplate its own sort of capabilities outside of the direction of the understanding. And this is what Kant has in mind when he talks about the harmonious free play of the imagination and understanding. That the
Like,
understanding concept is there, right? The concept exists. It's fully exemplified, but then there's more, and the imagination can then begin to consider and
uh,
apply its laws in different.
fly high in the sky, up to the sky, maybe.
Not too high though.
Not too
That's the
high.
not too high, because it is
Not too
always
high.
count. Not too high, because we
Yeah.
can't go beyond that content, right? We don't want to start
Mhm.
imagining, using the imagination to think about things that are unrelated, right? We don't want it to be capricious in Kant's terms, right? We want it to fly, but not too high, right? The story of Icarus, right?
Because,
So
yeah, you're right.
So that so it's not that when with that extra content it could just be anything, but it instead that content is always related back to the original concept. So, what might we think about, to use the example of a rose, right? That the rose is applied, but there's more to it, right? So we might apply other ideas like the danger of beauty, right? Roses have thorns. So there's this extra, connection that we can make there about the dangers of seeking beauty, or the duality of existence, right? With all beauty, there is danger, there is pain in the things that are pleasant, maybe, right? But all of these ideas don't refer to the rose in particular, right? That's not really the concept of rose, but it's where the imagination can play. It's where the imagination can draw new distinctions, new lines. It's where the imagination can connect with other concepts, right? It's where the imagination can generate new, like not necessarily new concepts, but new connections or new lawfulness rather than new laws in itself. But it becomes this space for us to engage in this free play while also maintaining a connection to experience. And I think that's what Kant has in mind with the free play, and that's how we can understand the imaginative free play through uh, the use of the imagination.
Through imagination, yes. Splendid explanation, I have to admit. Um, all thanks to this aesthetic judgment through imagination, um, which, of course, requires a principle according to Kant. It receives this from itself, the purposiveness of nature, because nature is ordered in such a way that is amenable to our power of judgment. As he himself says, it specifies its general laws into empirical ones in accordance with the form of a logical system in behalf of the power of nature. And at that point, I'd like to ask you, does this mean that we have to feel nature as a living entity and play by its own rules to think likewise?
So that's kind of gets to this idea of purposiveness,
Hmm.
right? So the
Yeah.
fact whether or not nature has its own rules, whether or not nature, I suppose we could look at it in sort of like in an Aristotelian sense, this idea of the telos of nature, right?
Yeah.
That's not objective knowledge that we can have, We can never know that, right? What we can do is we can examine or we can interact with nature as if it were structured, as if it had its own goals, as if it were, in the case of aesthetics and beauty, as if it were um, sort of designed for us, this being that can feel beauty. But but that can never be objective knowledge, right? We have to kind of interact with nature like it always under this in this way, always under that terms of as if.
As if, yeah.
As if, yes.
Yes, the nature is not purposive, but it can be reflected upon as if it were purposive, as you very well write um, in your article. Great. So, imagination, both sense shaping and also form shaping, produces that kind of principle of purposiveness, as we've been analyzing so far, through the capacity of both reflective judgment and also aesthetic one. An imagination as a faculty that bridges the gap between sensibility and understanding. And also have mentioned about this harmonious free play between imagination and understanding all along, on the source of pleasure. So there is also an element of pleasure in this aesthetic judgment, as you write and explain in your article, which is the result of harmony of the imagination and understanding. And you also state that we find a mutually expeditious relationship. So as if they go hand in hand, as they travel together, based on this source of pleasure. Now, as a first question, what kind of pleasure is this exactly? And what are the preconditions necessary in terms of personality traits to make someone take on such a journey of self-discovery as the last question?
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
So what was the first question? Because I kind of
yeah. I mean, what sort of pleasure is this?
Yeah, the type of pleasure.
Because
so
the source of pleasure. Yeah.
Sure.
They seem to get along. They seem to get along well together. Imagination, understanding, free play.
Yeah. And so I think the source of a lot of the pleasure is that if we remember from the first critique, the imagination existed in the service of the understanding, right? It's sometimes called a handmaiden of the understanding. The understanding is telling the imagination what to do, and the products of the imagination, the activities of the imagination are always in reference to the goals of the understanding. The pleasure that we feel is in the recognition of not only a harmony between us and nature, right? This purposive idea, but we also become aware of an almost like internal harmony, that there is a deeper harmony between our faculties, right? That it's like our faculties almost they don't have a superior subordinate relationship. They don't have to, but they could reach this accord with each other, this play with each other that's not one directing the other, but they're kind of both mutually beneficial
They're
with each other.
equal, as if they're equal.
As if, yes, exactly, as if they're equal. So we feel pleasure in a recognition of not only an exterior harmony between us and nature, but in an interior harmony within us as well, between our faculties, the types of things that are requisite for us to have experiences, that there's a deeper subjective harmony in there as well. And as for your second question, how do we encourage, or what type of person might take on this this goal or this task of becoming self-guided, in becoming sort of autonomous, if you would. What can we do to convince them? And for Kant, that is the value of beauty. That is the value of these experiences, the internal harmony and the external harmony. Because again, logically, rationally, in terms of our thinking, there should be no reason why our moral callings or our moral demands should link up with nature. There's no reason why that should happen. There's no objective connection to be drawn there. It's not science,
True, true.
right? And so that might lead us to despair, like, oh, well, I could, live this, moral life, but I'm never going to be happy. Like, nature might not care about my moral commands, and how am I supposed to sort of square this away?
But there is a
Well,
secret, though.
there is a secret. Yeah, the secret is revealed through this reflection, through this experience of beauty, that actually nature is amenable. Nature you can live both in accord with reason and in accord with nature. That's never anything you can know. That's never anything that you can point to scientifically, but it is something that you can live as if, right? And that idea of, well, maybe I can't know for sure 100% certainty that my moral goals and my moral obligations and duties can fit within nature, but nature's giving me signs that it's amenable to them. And so this idea to be autonomous, this goal to be a self-guided, person, a full, mature person. Um, Beauty and nature are giving us signs that this is the right thing to do. This is what is out there for us. And if we need the extra motivation, we can always think of the connection between ourselves and nature, and we can always think of the connection and relationship between our own thinking faculties as existing in this sort of deeper harmonious state. And that should, or that could, I suppose, provide the right type of moral motivation and the right type of intellectual motivation to be this fully autonomous, fully mature, fully enlightened individual.
Um, I'm you know, astonished by what you say. Would you like to say any other comments, any other whatever you'd like to refer to regarding Kant and his orientation thinking, and any broader comments?
Sure. So I'd like to kind of go back to one of the ways that I introduced my experience, my introduction to Kant. And I really want to stress the idea that he really is the thinker that has a profound impact on the way that we interact with the world.
Mhm.
And yet we don't hear about him. And so I like to one of the things that I like to do as someone who studies Kant is to just reiterate that idea that he
Mm.
is so influential, and he sets the stage for so many different intellectual movements in the 19th and 20th and now 21st century, that understanding him and having a basis in his thinking and what he was truly up to, what he was truly interested in, really helps us understand not only these intellectual movements, but really help us understand who we are. And that's kind of the task that I'm taking with Kant now, more recently. And I would be more than happy to come on again at a later time,
Yeah, of course.
and discuss the connection between Kantian philosophy and things like mental health and neurodiversity, because as those become important themes, and as those become emphasis
Mhm.
for not just for philosophers but for society as a whole, the mental health crisis, the focus on
Yeah.
mental health, I think Kant and Kantian philosophers can have a lot to say by uh, revealing or reintroducing this connection that Kantian philosophy has with a lot of our theories of the mind and a lot of our understandings of things like cognition and thinking and our relationship with reality.
Yeah. Are you writing an article on this issue?
Yes, I've written a couple articles on it. I'm going to be my first article. I'm going to be presenting it
Mhm.
in about about a month and a half to the Southern Society of Philosophy and Psychology. So I don't want to just have this as a conversation between philosophers, but I want it to be introduced to people who are familiar with psychology as well, people who work in the field of psychology, people who work in the field of things like therapy and other types of interventions. So I wanted to be introduced to them. So that's my first foray into this, and I've completed very recently, and I'm waiting for some comments on it. A more longer form paper that looks at the historical connections between the imagination and our current paradigms in cognition and our understanding of the connection between things like neurodivergence and our understanding of reality.
And we'll be very happy to discuss these issues with you once you complete your research. And please tell us where people can find you on social media and keep up to date with your latest research.
Absolutely. So I have a website. It's my name, Jackson, and then the letter R and then Hoerth .com. That is a website that I use jointly for philosophy and my other projects, which include writing fiction. So there's some fiction stuff in there, and then there's some philosophy stuff. So feel free to check that out. And That's probably the best place to find me. And then of course as my papers become a little bit more polished and my ideas become a little bit more refined, certainly there will be future publications that I will be happy to make you and your community aware of if this is a topic that they find interesting.
Great, great. We had a great discussion today with Dr. Jackson Hoerth, university professor at the University of Texas at Tyler.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Bye bye. Have a nice day.